thank you both for being here. We have, so much respect and gratitude for the way you've both influenced our lives directly and indirectly. And so we're really excited to have you both here on the podcast and to introduce our listeners a little bit more to you, especially John. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Aubrey and Tim.
If it's okay, we've been getting to know your story a little bit more, and I would love to start at what feels like the beginning for me and just hear about some of the maybe formative experiences that you had in your growing up years that come to mind as you reflect about the direction that your life took and how you came to this point.
Yeah, I'd be happy to get started with that. I grew up in Salt Lake City as a non-Mormon, with a mother who was very anti-Mormon and a father who had not been active for years. So it was a secular upbringing, and I had a great friend in high school. I didn't make friends easily and didn't like cliques and whatnot, but on my high school swimming team, I got to know a Latter-day Saint friend, Scott Cameron, who just emanated love and inclusion and somehow transcended all that cliquey tribalism of high school. And I was really drawn to what he represented, that he was kind to everybody and he was kind to me. And so that was a connection with the church, because he was a real dedicated member of the church and went on a mission. We both headed down to Stanford together for a year. And I transferred back to the University of Utah. And by the time I'd graduated, I'd gotten very involved in leadership and student activities, but finally decided to take a leap of faith and decided that I was an atheist. Although the great mentor that I had found at the University of Utah was my favorite professor, Professor Neil Maxwell, and became very close to him. And he paid a lot of attention to this awkward, secular young guy at the University of Utah. And I just, in my mind, I thought there's something about this Professor Maxwell, there's something about this Scott Cameron that I'm just aligned with these people. But nevertheless, given the strange things that minds do, I decided I was an atheist, because that's the way I had been raised, and had heard all the bad things about the Mormon Church. And I most of my friends were Latter-day Saints and nice people, but I was just happy to leave all that behind, and left did a year of graduate study in Germany, which changed a lot of things. So that's kind of a little brief background in terms of this, very secular background, very kind of an anti-Mormon upbringing, who felt deeply aligned with two Latter-day Saint examples, my main examples in my life. My parents kind of suggested that if I was crazy enough to even consider the Mormon religion, please wait till you're an adult, just grow up. So, so I kind of honored that, and I just sort of was open to good, nice friends, good Latter-day Saints. But nevertheless, I was kind of a science guy and believed in science. I thought religion seemed to be on a different plane than science was. And as much as I was, deeply moved by the presence of some of my Latter-day Saint friends, my mind wasn't there. I just didn't think it was an option. And yet, down deep, not really acknowledging it fully to myself, a lot of groundwork was laid, particularly by those two people, but being around Latter-day Saints. But at the same time, growing up in high school and all the clickiness and the cruelty that happens, I thought, Mormon or non-Mormon, there are a lot of cruel cliques around, and you can say one thing in terms of what you believe, but how you behave might be a different thing. So I was kind of neutral, friendly with church members, friendly with non-church members, and committed to sort of my secular orientation. And I thought, well, maybe when I get older, I'll be interested in the church. But again, when I graduated from college, I thought, well, I just don't believe that that's an option. And actually, maybe I ought to just decide that I'm an atheist. So that's what I did.
So where did that begin to change?
Well, I had a fellowship for a year at the University of Hamburg in Germany studying political philosophy. And one of the things I had to acknowledge to myself was that I really didn't know who I was. And maybe this was a great opportunity to just sort of evaluate my own beliefs, my own understanding, who I was personally. And that's almost why I made a leap of faith, so I could take a position and then explore it. And I didn't even know what meditation was, but I found myself, living in a room by myself for an academic year. And I just ended up spending endless hours sensing into what do I believe and what does my culture, background mean for who I am and what I should believe. And it actually became a fairly slippery slope, and I felt pretty lost, and uh, for months just sort of descended into really kind of despair because there was nothing there. And finally, I hit bottom and found this inner resonance there. I didn't know what I was looking for, but there it was, and it was like a little bit of a tuning fork that I found. Finally, there's something here to trust. I was sure that the way my mind worked and how people process things mentally, you can be convinced of anything, but I found something solid, something, and I didn't really accept it as, well, this is the spirit of God or anything, but it was a sense that it connects me to everything. There's a sense of knowledge and wisdom, and I had to acknowledge there was something spiritual about that. It was different than anything that I had encountered before, and so it was remarkable, and it really resulted from really months of stillness and sitting, and settling into seeking for something that was solid.
Yeah, I think that probably has a lot of resonance for people that are currently deconstructing. And I've, been through like deconstructing at least, the faith of their youth or maybe the faith tradition that they grew up in. I've been in I feel like what is potentially a similar situation where once you start deconstructing, it can feel like a slippery slope and you can't tell where the bottom is going to be, in the sense that everything that you thought you understood, you now recognize as a construct. And you recognize that brains and hormones are very powerful things. And the things that once seemed very solid to you get called into question. So I'm wondering if you have more words of wisdom for somebody that is sort of in a disorienting deconstruction process right now, on what I guess on what might be a way to determine if something truly has that solidity to it that you describe.
Well, what I learned, it was in an amorphous way, a way that I completely understand, when I was over in Germany for a year. But I found that beyond the constructs of the mind, there is something. If you go inside of yourself, ultimately you can find something. You can find the grounding. At least I found that. And so, whether you're coming from a faith orientation or not, it seems to me that however you're working with the constructs of your mind and the way you frame things and they're falling apart, that there is a way to find something down deep, that you can rely on. And that's the story of my life.
Mm.
Uh,
Thomas,
Thank
do you
you.
want to weigh in on that at all? I feel like you must have some thoughts here.
And can I broaden that question just a little bit? Because I would love to
Sure.
hear your thoughts. There were, John, in your life, there were this was it felt like the first season of real deep despair, but there were multiple seasons where you talk about this kind of this depression, like this real feeling of hopelessness, and the context would change. But I would love to just understand these seasons of what we've heard you call, Thomas, contraction. Like, what role do you think they're playing in our life? Because I think probably most of us really try to orient our lives to avoid these ebbs.
Yeah. Right as you asked that question, I was thinking in my mind, I have a geeky developmental comment to make about this. And I'll say a little something and see if the spirit flees the moment I say it, or if it opens up possibilities to something that would actually be spiritually helpful to people listening. But as I hear you reflect, Tim, on your deconstruction like phase period, and John, similarly, when you're in Germany, probably mid-20s, I think, if I'm getting your chronology right, John. But I think of a phase in human development that we all have the capacity to go through, that we're invited to go through as we're kind of fulfilling the measure of our creation, if you will. But as we recognize that, like, our whole landscape of beliefs and the way we orient to life with what we take to be true, that starts to feel very slippery and deconstruct. And I hear you, John, pointing to, like, at the very bottom of this trajectory, there's something solid, there's a resonance, there's, in my words, like what I was thinking as you both were talking, is that in that developmental process of the mind as we knew it breaking down, it's new kinds of knowing and new kinds of intelligence coming online. There's a resonance in the body. The body knows in a way that the thinking mind can't know. For some of us, the heart comes online more powerfully. So if I were to kind of interpret this through the lens of God's love and grace, this developmental phase that can be so harrowing, it's actually like tilling the soil to allow deeper kinds of faith and deeper forms of witness to come through. And I think Tim and John, your stories are both conveying that really powerfully.
Wow, thank you. And John, you write, I mean, this feels like what you write about, that when you start considering, you really start looking into, maybe you're interested in joining the church in a formal way. You write that the literalisms of the truth claims were really not, you weren't really accepting those, but that you were kind of looking beyond them, and you recognize this deeper resonance, and that the deeper resonances are what felt right. It seemed like on some level you were cognizant that those resonances might be something in your mind, or like it was kind of an experiment, maybe, to decide to go all in and trust something that was maybe still feeling illogical. But as you look back now, do you feel like those deeper resonances were a trustworthy inner compass, or just a necessary part of your development? Or how have you sort of metabolized that experience of deciding to join the church based on a feeling?
Well, I had a pretty dramatic conversion experience where I really, beyond normal language, heard a confirmation that the Book of Mormon and this whole spiritual field that Joseph Smith channeled and shared, it was authentic and was real. And my mind wasn't there, but somehow my soul was. It accepted what was said, and I really struggled with that. I mean, I took a period of time to just sort of endlessly debate whether my mind I was hallucinating, or I can't accept these things, and yet something down deep resonated deeply. But what really, and I decided to join the church on that basis. But the thing that really became the guiding light for me was when I had an opportunity to meet with my great uncle, who was happened to be president of the church at the time, President Joseph Fielding Smith. And I said, I've just joined the church, but I have a lot of questions, and I'm just not sure of a lot of things. And he basically said, John, I just promise you that if you do justly love mercy, and walk humbly with God, what you need to know in the way that you need to know it will come about. So it was commit to that trust in the Lord, live accordingly. I mean, he was quoting Micah 6:8. I didn't realize it at the time, which I've heard many times since. And if you have a spiritual breakthrough and you found something, but you have all sorts of questions, that to me was the ultimate answer and the ultimate guide is follow that advice, follow that scripture, follow that prophetic wisdom of doing justly, loving mercy, and walking humbly with God, doing the best you can to love those in your life and to honor that which you do know. And it creates an opening for a deeper understanding to occur, even as your mind is spinning.
Yeah. I'm struck by this sort of like very interesting and potentially beautiful mirroring that your story and Thomas's have, at least from my perspective, where you grew up in a household that you described as anti-Mormon in some ways. And Thomas, if it's fair, I might call your household anti-Mormon. You know, it was like as Mormon as it gets.
It's very
and,
fair. It's
and
even
you both
insightful, Tim.
And you both, in a way, sort of rejected those paradigms of your childhoods before somehow coming back and now finding yourselves at a very similar point. Has this occurred to you, Thomas? Have you processed that as you've grown in your relationship with John?
It took a very perceptive interviewer to draw that out just now, Tim. I'd never thought of my life in those terms.
Okay.
Come to think
well,
of it.
we could cut that question, no problem.
It's amazing. I'm so happy you said it. And I think I mean, you've intuited something that no one's articulated in that way, but the way I came to meet John felt deeply intuitive. I was really magnetized by who John is and not knowing any of his story at the time, but just the life he was living. It was actually the kind of gospel I think I'd wanted to be living my whole life, but it had eluded me. I don't know if you want to say something about it, John, or if this is my turn to introduce how I kind of came into your orbit.
Oh, please go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you offered the brilliant framing, Tim, of these like, you know, maybe two poles, maybe two
yeah.
extremes. We came from very different environments. And the environment I grew up in didn't work for me at that time and that season of my life. And like John, without knowing it, it had left me with a deep longing. And my whole life was a search for that. And I didn't even know exactly what it was. I remember coming home from China. I just spent my second year in China and I was coming back through Utah. And my mom's best friend, also, they're both named Liz. My mom's best friend, Liz, said, "Oh, I just read an article about this Mormon who meditates." And she knew that I liked meditation. That it was just that it was that simple and unassuming. I'm like, oh, great. She passes me this article that John T. Kesler had penned.
Yeah. And there was only one Mormon that meditated at that time.
Yeah, it was very easy to find the
and
only other Mormon
he was in the news.
all of the Western Hemisphere who meditated. It didn't take long. And I read the article and I was so struck by it. Struck doesn't quite capture it. Like something in the article really pierced me to the core. John used the term spiritual field a moment ago. Like there's this field of revelatory and divine power that sometimes we refer to as our faith, our church, our tradition. And in this article, it was just glowing with it, this article. And this guy, John Kesler, was talking about his time serving as head legal counsel in Europe, Africa. It was a massive purview back in the day before they had divided that up into other regions. And he happened to be working with the general authority there, who was Joseph Worthland. And, you know, my family and I, we were living in their house, you know, on Military Drive while they were in Germany. And John writes in this article in such an intimate way about how the Spirit moved this man. And he didn't pull any punches. John didn't pull any punches in the article. He says, I wouldn't describe Elder Worthland as, quick, in terms of, intellectually quick. It was that like something deeper was moving through him and guiding him. And as I was reading John's words, I thought, this man, granddad to me, whose presence similar to Scott Cameron, similar to Professor Maxwell in John's life, this man, Joseph Worthland, and his wife, Elisa, who we don't tell enough stories about, but his presence and his way of being had changed me in spite of myself. At the times where I was really clear that I was rejecting a way of life that didn't work for me, my grandparents' way of being absolutely worked for me in every way. And John was writing about this intimate relationship with him where, Elder Worthland's life was like a moving meditation. He'd just wake up in the morning and ask what the Spirit wanted him to do. And the way John talked about it, I felt like a homesickness. There were words all of a sudden to what my heart had been longing for so long. And I felt how intimately John knew this man, but I think even more importantly, how intimately John knew this spiritual field and what this power was that was moving this man that I loved so much. And John was generous to provide a little email at the end of his article. I don't even know if I finished the article before I just jumped to the end, got the email, and it said, I really need to meet you. And that was the beginning of a new life for me. Really, it was the gospel that I'd always wanted to live, and I just didn't quite know how to get a foothold into it.
At that point that you read the article, can I ask what your relationship with the church was? Were you practicing?
Very similar to what John's relationship was when he was in his 20s in Germany. I'd been living in China. Okay. I was in my late 20s at that point. I had been completely distanced and estranged from the church for over 15 years. 15 years at that point. I'd had nothing to do with it.
Wow. Thank you.
Yeah, I was always on the lookout for people who were somewhat estranged and somewhat wandering, because I just knew, based on the process that I had gone through, the deep reality of the Spirit and ways that you could find that to resonate, and using different language and being a little bit aware maybe of some developmental issues. And so I was just so grateful to have Thomas reach out to me. And I was trying to connect with other people as well, because I could see so clearly that there's a time to struggle, and at different seasons of our life that happens, and yet there's something down deep that's there that can hold us and nurture us. And all I was wanting to be was to be a little bit of a midwife, to open the door to the Spirit, to create a zone of safety and trust in a way that maybe that zone could be explored a little bit. Having said that, it wasn't my agenda to kind of get Thomas active again, but it was my agenda to be there as a loving person who could be welcoming and hold the Spirit in a certain way that might be helpful.
Yeah.
Can you say, either or both of you, I'm thinking about this spiritual field and how I think in my own experience, the truth claims of the church that started to feel that I started to really experience a lot of doubt about, I think those started obscuring the spiritual field. Like it was so close to my face, I couldn't think about anything else. And I definitely wasn't being nourished by whatever the church could give me access to, because I felt like I couldn't see anything but this very literal, legal way to interpret everything that the church had ever said to me. But I'm also aware that that kind of deconstruction was really important to get to the bottom of it, to get to what was real, like you were talking about. There are probably a lot of people listening who are thinking, I don't want to ignore these things that feel really alive right now and scary, and they aren't nourishing me, but they feel really important. Like what role does that season of your faith play when it's just the only thing you feel like you have bandwidth to process?
My lived experience and what I've found to be very powerful and helpful in working kind of in a ministerial capacity with people in the community or in their own struggles and developmental process with faith is that these, what we call beliefs and what we sometimes call truth claims related to the church, they serve a powerful function to scaffold one's faith, one's development, perhaps throughout their whole life. For some, throughout their whole lives. For others, what was the scaffolding and what facilitated faith and trust in the gospel actually comes to hinder it at a certain point.
Mm.
So I find this was certainly true for myself, that, you know, when I was young, I was nourished by certain beliefs and truth claims. And then all at once, without any warning, they were all getting in the way. They were all getting in the way. And connecting again to this field, this resonance, you know, a mentor and an elder on the path in John, what I came to realize over time was astonishing to me. And the only inadequate words I have to describe it is that the gospel is actually truer than we realize. What we actually care about, whatever the gospel actually is, it's deeper and more powerful and profound than we can express. And when I actually lived into that truth for myself, the beliefs and the truth claims were no longer foregrounded in the way, obscuring my vision again. I was living in this powerful, divine, spiritual reality that it took a mentor to open me up to a little bit. And after that, I felt perhaps the same. Oh, this will just take me a moment. It's really meaningful to me. The same heart John had, you know, just that heart and those eyes scanning the horizon for, are there people who feel estranged from this infinite goodness for good reasons, for honest reasons? And is there a way that we can help them connect back into this beneficence? And I don't think John maybe even realizes how successful he was, you know, it helping with my conversion and showing me a path that could hopefully be helpful to others. And I've certainly spent a lot of my life since I've met John scanning the horizon for similar souls.
Thank you.
Maybe I could pose a question that's related to that I'd be curious to hear both your takes on. I've been trying to, and this is a question that I genuinely have. I've been trying to develop some sort of heuristic or framework for when beliefs actually matter. It sort of gets to this question of orthopraxy versus orthodoxy, correct practice versus correct belief. And it seems clear that in some way beliefs matter in the sense that they drive our actions. If you see everyone around you as a infinitely dignified and worthy child of God, that will drive a certain type of action. And yet it does seem like for many people, the nitty gritty and the particularities of certain belief systems seem to, at the very least, fade into the background as they move throughout their lives. So I don't know. Can I throw that to either of you and just say, what's your take? When do beliefs matter, and how might we think about that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the heart of the gospel and the reality of the Savior and the Father is love, and I think it has to boil down to that. And if something is interfering with that, that shuts off the empathy and the compassion and the concern and the love and putting limitations on all of that, that's a sign that something's awry. And so I think whatever the particular constructs or issues or the evolution you're trying to do, if you can get down to that deep quality of trust and the love in the Lord and the love that flows out of that, I think it creates a framework to hold everything else.
Yeah, thank you. Thomas, anything you want to add?
Echoing John, that true love is deeply vulnerable. And my experience is that when I'm really vulnerable in love, there's no time for a belief. I'm moved to do something that often scares me because it makes me so vulnerable. So I like you, not only do I not see anything wrong with belief, of course we have belief, but in the moments that feel most guided and most inspired in my life, it's maybe almost never that I had this belief and I'm going to do it because I believe this, but it's something deeper just takes me. And maybe after the fact, I can reflect on it and say that that represented some belief. But for me, growth in the gospel has been kind of a willingness to not take recourse in any formulas of how I should live my life. And that's a scary thing, because like to have some kind of formula tells me I'm going to be okay if I follow this formula, and that I've found can easily become a defense against a deeper vulnerability. I think similar to what John's saying in my own words.
You know, another way to frame it too is that the Spirit can help confirm something for us. And that's maybe moving beyond beliefs, but it's actually getting to a deeper source of truth. And maybe we need to put on pause a particular set of framings that we have. But I think the deepest way to stay anchored is to center oneself in trust and to live as you should. And principles are there, and the Spirit is there to guide us. And I just think sometimes it takes real patience, maybe even years, of hanging on to that deeper quality of trust and love to be able to help frame things in the way that is most helpful. And there's an interesting polarity, speaking of what President Smith said to me about my questions, is I asked President Wirthlin, then soon to be Elder Wirthlin, at a quiet moment, what's the most important thing that frames your life? What do you do? And he said, without hesitation, he says, well, I try to live justly and love mercy and walk humbly with God. And so in a way, whichever direction it was from, somebody who's on the verge of becoming an apostle to somebody who's struggling to know anything, the advice and the guidance was just trust and do it, move forward. And the things that are flowing and the flux that's there, if you can hold the faith in that way, things will sort themselves out, most likely. And it's wonderful to have good friends and those who can be with you to hold you in that vulnerability. But yeah, in a way, it isn't moving beyond belief. It's getting to the source of belief, which is ultimately love and patience and living the way you should.
I'm thinking about when you mentioned in your early 20s how you said you sort of staked out this position of atheism, and that also sort of allowed you to explore whatever resistance came up because of that position that you had staked out. And so I'm wondering what role you think the church, that sort of offers some scaffolding. It offers this container that you might feel resistance toward. What can the church do for us in our own development? And is that the church's role to encourage adult development?
Well, I just look forward to the day when that then awareness of adult development can be more explicitly with us, because so much can be understood with that framework, and so much can be done if you come from that place and understand that and can connect with people heart to heart, mind to mind, sensing sort of where they're at. Yeah, I think it's just a matter of time. I think it will.
Mm.
And that's why sometimes you have to find people like Thomas, who in a lower lights community, that can connect and mentor and hold when things are difficult. And which is so ironic, because I know of no other faith tradition which is so invested in growing into the fullness of our divine DNA.
Yeah.
It's there. It's calling us, and this is just one lens to do that. And I think it's just a matter of time before that sinks up more fully and more deeply. But I think having people who have that training, who have a deep gospel sensibility, they can provide a lot of assistance along the way by helping connect with you where you're at.
John, could you talk about how you got involved not only in adult development, but in meditation in the days before it was cool, someone might say?
Yeah, well, I mean, I had this year-long private meditation in my early 20s, but years later, and this was after being legal counsel for the church and whatnot, I happened to walk into I attended a workshop on mediation, not meditation, because I'm an attorney. And the person who was running that training was a student of Genpo Roshi, who was the head of the largest Zen lineage in the world, headquartered outside of Japan. And he was headquartered in Salt Lake City. And he had just come up with this new technique of speaking through voice dialogue. That's a Jungian therapeutic technique where classically you say, I'd like to speak to the vulnerable child, and then you speak from that place within yourself. And he found, he had just discovered with his senior students and his monks that he could speak to transcendent aspects, and they would have breakthroughs much more rapidly and could speak authentically from these deep spiritual places. And so the organizer of this workshop said, well, why don't you just try this on people off the street? Who knows? Because if you can, this sense of oneness, this Zen sense of being one with all, if a mediator can be one with everybody in the room, wouldn't that be a great service? So he just tried it out, and I walked into a breakout session, and 90 minutes later, my life was turned upside down. I think the other 59 people walked out and said that was an interesting experience, but I was having this full-on unity experience. And I was kind of upset about it. I didn't come to this training to have my life changed, but it was profound and deep, and it didn't go away. I mean, it stuck with me for a couple of weeks. And so I contacted him and said, I am just, I'm a Latter-day Saint. I'm connected to my faith tradition, committed to my faith tradition, but I've got to know about this. What happened there? I want to understand this. And so and he was very happy to welcome me as a non-Buddhist student, because this process he had developed called the Big Mind process, he wanted to share with the world, with everybody. And I could only be a very part-time student, but I studied it for about 4 years and was one of the first 4 people that he approved to be a Big Mind facilitator. And so I didn't quite know how to fit it together, going to elders quorum or high priest quorum at that time, and having a deep testimony, and then having this dramatic experience that didn't seem to fit. But being trained in human development and sort of the integral movement, which I was very involved in, I just started developing my own approach to this, and didn't really take the Big Mind process very far, because I just felt that there was a way to meditate, a way to hold some of this wisdom that wasn't strictly Zen and wasn't strictly Mormon, but it was deeply informed by my Mormon identification and resonance with the patterns and the contraries and all of that. And so I got onto about a 20-year path of working with this and developing a practice that worked for me, that I began to share with people, and was trying to be very cautious about not to confuse it with, I'm not teaching an alternative to the church here. I'm teaching a way to deepen and deep inner stillness in the context of human development. And that's sort of was the trigger, was that dramatic experience wandering into a 90-minute breakout session.
Yeah, I'm actually very, very, very interested in those types of experiences, what you I think called a unity experience. Could you describe a little bit more what it was that you were feeling or sensing when you had that experience?
Well, the experience is, it isn't like you don't have a body anymore, or you aren't, these aren't my hands or these aren't my emotions, but you have a deeper identification that you are everything. You're one with everything, and it is something you can't explain through words, because I had read several books on Zen, but nothing had prepared me for this experience. And this was a way of facilitating people in a very prompt way, quick way to give them an experience. And yeah, and I don't see any church teachings that teach that explicitly, but it's a foundational realization out of which comes light and love and life. And from my point of view, it's completely consistent with the restored gospel, but it is distinct. And I think people have those experiences naturally, but to be trained in it and stabilize in it is a profound opportunity for spiritual deepening.
That is remarkable. Thomas, I feel like you must have something to add here.
There are a lot of different things we could talk about, but I think it's worth saying in the moment, and this is certainly my experience. I mean, first, I share a lineage with John in that when I was 18 years old, living in downtown Salt Lake, I saw a flyer stapled to a telephone pole, and it was a workshop with Genpo Roshi. He'd just come to Utah and was like kind of trying out his new craft on like apparently any college kid, off the street. And, my experience with Genpo also blew my mind and planted a seed and showed me that there was a profound spiritual reality to this tradition he was representing. And that training really came to fruition in my life, spending time with John here. But as that training came to fruition, and as that experience of unity that John's talked about became more normal for me, scriptures that I'd grown up with my entire life that didn't really register as anything. I didn't know what to make of them, basically. When Christ talks about, I am the vine and ye are the branches, or abide in me as I abide in you, and I and the Father are one, and all of this language of unity that's just peppered throughout the entire New Testament, it's really like the savor of the text. It's the spiritual field that text generates, if you will. All of a sudden, it went from words to actually like this recognition, like, all that this witness of Christ wants is for us to feel intimate with God's creation. And what do I mean by intimate? Like, love your neighbor as your very own being. Love your neighbor to the point that you feel the same intimacy with your neighbor as you feel with yourself. And in that way, in doing so, you'll love God. They're actually, the first and the second commandment are the same commandment. That I couldn't understand that until I'd really felt it in my body and my heart and my mind at every level. And this gets back to the theme that's been the most meaningful theme of my life, that like all those beliefs about church and history, and there's a lot of disagreement around what to believe in and what to emphasize in the gospel. But for me, I realized, oh wow, this is truer than true. gospel is an invitation. It's like one of the most moving scenes in the whole gospel. The New Testament to me is when Christ comes out of the desert. And I imagine, maybe I read this into the text, but I think it honors the text. Christ comes out of the desert just crying out, I think, with a kind of joy. And maybe after 40 days fasting in the desert, he looked a bit like a raving madman, but like with real joy, saying like, it's right here. Like, if you would trust this good news, you'd see it right now. And that invitation has completely captured my heart, you know, not as a belief for later and things will get really good later, but an intimacy in the kingdom of God that's closer than at hand. So to me, I think that's the reality that John speaks to.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
And essentially, I developed a practice to sort of having those deep transcendent experiences in the context of a practice that were completely consistent with the gospel and consistent with human development was my that was my way to sort of supplement my life in the gospel, to create that deepening in the context of human development.
I remember years ago, Thomas, having a conversation about this temptation we might have to honeymoon in traditions outside of our own, and that real work happens when you go deep somewhere, which we've seen that certainly. Like it gets hard when you go deep. But what I feel like I hear you both saying is that this is an orientation that you're bringing to the depth. It's helping you go deep here. And so what fertile ground are you recognizing in the restoration that feels hopeful to you, that this is a place where you can go deep and grow? I think some people, when they have this experience, like the experiences that you're talking about, they start wondering, like, should I go somewhere else for this kind of nourishment? Like, if it's exciting and new and fresh, there may be this feeling that, oh, maybe this means that my soul wants something else. And so I would just love to hear what you think. Like, what's the fertile ground that you're recognizing here in our own tradition?
Because the restored gospel is so full of what Joseph Smith called contraries, of things that seem opposite, but really from a deeper spiritual place, they're part of a greater whole, a deeper whole. I think one reason not to honeymoon elsewhere, but to honeymoon right here, is to sense that this is a sign of human maturity, that you can hold things that seem to be either or in a both and way. And Joseph Smith intuited that dramatically in a way that nobody else has, a deeper quality of truth. And when you can move to sort of that meditated place of holding what seem to be paradoxes, you can know something in a spiritual way that you can't hold in your mind. Ultimately, maybe you can hold it in your mind, but the restored gospel has just all sorts of opportunities to practice in that way. And I've designed IPP specifically to be able to practice in terms of seemingly opposites being complementary to a deeper whole. And the center of that is a deep transcendent spiritual place where the Spirit can speak to you. And that stillness is what President Nelson, how many times a year, is saying, find a place of stillness so that you can receive inspiration. And I don't know any tradition that holds that as well and as deeply. And I just look for wonderful ways to teach that, particularly in the developmental context, that are just going to be happening, just going to be coming down the road sooner rather than later. I'm
really moved by what you just said, John. For me, like in response to that question, like why set up residence here in this tradition? The spiritual field is infinitely deep and rich, and we have a theology that asks us to become everything. That is such a bold invitation to become everything. And as John's pointing to, what we understand about human transformation and development and theologically divinization that's coming into a new light in our generation, in this dispensation. And it's something that has become, I'd like to think, a healthy obsession of mine, because once John pointed out this field to me and the developmental dynamics of what's unfolding, I'm not aware of a human community, a religious tradition on the planet that has built the structure, the scaffolding, the architecture around what it would take for a church, a religion, to be genuinely developmental. And why wouldn't that be us? Not as a sense of like being more special than others, but like there's nothing that would stop us from building that and contributing that as our legacy, our gift to humanity. And we won't do it alone, of course, but we have such gifts already right here in hand to build together. I'm totally compelled by that vision.
Thank you. I wonder if it'd be possible for you to just give us a little taste, like a little example of what you mean when you talk about holding contraries and like that still point. Is there an example that you could, just to whet people's appetite?
Sure. Aubrey, I'd be happy to share one that's, just at the very center of the gospel is the relational polarity. It's sort of the middle of 21 polarities that I work with in terms of a vertical hierarchy, but it's agency, the quality of being separate and choiceful and an agent, and communion, and being connected with others, being in community. And you look at politics, and it's usually, it's all about freedom, or it's all about social justice and equality. But the restored gospel uniquely holds both agency and communion, and they come together. And a Zion community isn't about a bunch of clones. It's about the fact that we are all expected to be in a community of revelation together, listening to our leaders, but also they're listening to us. And it's like the council form of government, of governance in the church. The bishop or whoever it is isn't so much telling everybody what to do, but his job is to recognize the field of collective revelation that is arising. And so we, for instance, work with that. And there's a trajectory of maturity where they come together, and then they drop down into a still point. And the deepest still point is a deep, profound quality of trust. Trust in God. And that's separate from what concepts you might have. Anybody can find it. Down deep, there's a deep, transcendent quality of trust. We call that the still point, or the virtue of being. And out of each of these still points arises a quality of becoming, an attitude, transcendent attitude, non-egoic attitude, and a transcendent quality of doing. And what comes out of having deep trust is the quality of transcendent hopefulness in this moment, and a deep quality of love. And all of these transcendent virtuous qualities, they echo all sorts of patterning. I mean, this is faith, hope, and charity. It's deep trust, hopefulness, and love. And so it's finding a way, stage by stage, of a particular tension or quality that you have to go through to move into that next stage of development. Find the still point, find the virtues that flow out of it. So it's hard. It sounds pretty abstract, but it's it's a beautiful practice. It's essentially a character and virtue practice that aligns with each stage of our development. And that still point, like trust in this one, but another one is abundance or fullness. But you ask people what their experience is, it's always the same experience, a deep quality of peacefulness, being outside of space and time. And so, in other words, you're opening to the realm of spirit so that you're more deeply open to that, and carry that stillness that we're asked to find, to be open to deeper inspiration and be a vehicle for love, and to be more life affirming in all that we do.
What does a practice of that look like? Is it just a matter of exploring the polarities and letting it find a home inside you and recognizing it? Or is there, how do you explore both sides of those polarities?
I'm just going to let this be a sharing opportunity, because I was working with this practice when Thomas and I met, and he became the most dedicated and the most talented student of this practice. And he's really a master of it, and knows how to be with people and practice with it. And so I'll maybe just ask you, Thomas, to comment on that, because you're so talented in how you share the practice, in retreats and in other settings.
That's how John punts a really hard question.
Yeah.
let me have my very talented students speak to that. But I will say, what we're doing right now, which is actually incredibly complex, but none of us are thinking about it. We're talking to each other and we're using human language. And because we have a fluency and a familiarity with the language we're using, you don't have to think about the words I'm saying. I just say it and you have the meaning and you respond without a thought. And we've been going on like this for a long time. And what John is pointing to in IPP, this still point, to think about a still point would be way too slow. Like if you're thinking about the still point has already passed you by. But it's something we get used to. It's something we feel in the body, like the way we like develop a linguistic reflex of hearing a word and responding with another word. We get used to this sense of like, I've lived my life in tension, and then all of a sudden I see the possibility of becoming bigger, so that rather than struggling between agency, communion, bouncing around like a pinball, I have this moment where maybe a teacher models it for me, or maybe life just reveals this moment of deep trust where I trust myself, I trust God, I trust what's unfolding. And it's really helpful to have someone point out when that moment comes, like, notice what's happening in your heart, notice what's happening in your body, notice how calm and quiet your mind is. When you find that stillness outside of time and space, you get used to it. You get so used to it that when things get loud again and I feel these tensions flare up, I remember, like, there's another way to be. There's a perspective that the gospel invites me to move through life with, which is not trapped in these tensions, but it's a release from them. It's a deeper peace and a freedom. A story I've told people about this. It's a very simple story, as these stories go. I was in a sacrament meeting once, and a friend of mine who passed several years ago, beautiful musician from Italy, and he was giving a talk, and he said, "I'm grateful for everything that God has given me." And then he paused. He said, "And I'm grateful for everything God has taken away." And when he said that, there was just this hush. It was this palpable hush in the congregation where he took everybody to this still point, just like that. Like, because as the natural man and woman and person, we live in this drama of gain and loss. I want to gain good things and get rid of bad things. And in a moment, he cut through that, and he just shown gratitude through gain and loss. And he liberated 100 people in that congregation in a moment by showing us that slipstream into the still point. And you could feel it. Still point practices like that, you notice those moments enough times, and pretty soon you realize, like, all of creation is God's revelation to us of this spiritual reality. God created polarities and tensions in order to help us exercise these spiritual capacities, we could say. It's that simple, and it's so subtle, I think we look past it.
We just try to find opportunities and training frameworks for people to have that experience, to become familiar with it, and then it can just become your own practice with endless opportunities and for application. But the key thing is to have somebody who can guide you, who can hold that still point, who can hold those transcendent virtues so that you can feel into them and be held. And the amazing thing, it isn't, you need to be trained in it. Those qualities are already there. I'd like to speak to transcendent trust. If your mind will let you, it's already there. I'd like to speak to that quality of abundance and gratitude, no matter what. It's already there. It's already there. Yeah, and so it's a beautiful uncovering process, primarily to help people wake up to the beauty that and divinity that's already within them,
Yeah.
and that is clearly within the restored gospel. And this is just, it's a practice to sort of help with that.
Yeah. It makes me excited because it also feels like it's within you, and also the curriculum is your life. Like, you don't have to pull yourself out of your life. This is a thing that you'll have opportunity to practice moment to moment every day, with whatever arises. Where can people who are also feeling some energy around this learn about it, learn more, start practicing?
Well, both Thomas and I have our own respective organizations. I have the IPPinstitute.com, which is a website, and we offer courses. And Thomas offers courses through the lower lights, and we're doing more and more together. We're really kind of co-holding the tradition now. Thomas is fully transmitted as a master teacher. We're on a plane together, and we're looking to do some offerings later this year together as well. I don't know, Thomas, if you might want to mention that. I think you have the dates.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a good moment to ask that question, Aubrey. Something has possessed John in the last year, which I had, and knowing him almost 20 years, this is the first time I've seen John like really actively reaching out and just being, not that he's never been generous, but the level of generosity I've seen from John, and just sharing this path has been remarkable. And so we're a lot busier this year. Later in the summer, August, John and I are going to get together for a 3-day workshop in Salt Lake City, and right after that workshop, I'll be doing a 7-day more immersive retreat in these polarities, and focused on the meditative aspect and just really deepening in the still point, so that people can take that into their daily lives and recognize it more readily as it comes up in their daily lives. So August, there'll be a lot of action in person. And we've been talking with Faith Matters the last little bit about doing a Zoom course, just something that would be like really accessible to everybody at low cost and, easy to access from anywhere. There's a lot happening this year.
I wonder if, as we move toward close here, John, Thomas a few minutes ago sort of painted a vision of what the Latter-day Saint tradition might be able to offer the world. He was speaking in terms of its sort of like natural engagement with developmental practice. I wonder if you might, having lived through decades of deep engagement with the Latter-day Saint tradition, and also a really unique perspective contemplatively and developmentally, if you might share, and this is something that Faith Matters has talked a lot about, and Patrick Mason even wrote a book on this. What do you envision could be in store when you're speaking from the voice of, abundance or optimism? What could be for this tradition in the next 100 years?
Well, I think the genius of the tradition is that we have living prophets, and we have a community of revelation together. And I have no advice in terms of what you do better than making covenants and living them, and discovering the beauty of temple covenants and life covenants that you make. But I also feel, and this is a both and thing, not an either or thing, that as we find ways to help people as a practical matter achieve that deep inner peacefulness in some of those more transcendent spaces, to open themselves up more readily and more deeply to the spirit. And as we become more aware of this particular matrix of development, stages of development, as one of the ways to understand growing into the fullness of our divinity, that I believe some of the challenges that we have in terms of losing so many beautiful young people and still not making a major impact in the world the way we would want to, in the time frame that we would want to, think that will open up the doors. And I think the way Thomas suggested that as a tradition, we're so honoring of truth wherever we find it, and be willing to integrate that as we go along. And Aubrey talked about having a honeymoon somewhere, but and I said here's an alternative to a honeymoon, but actually there's an openness to the world of truth wherever we find it, and continuing to enrich our own tradition and depth. I think it's the beauty and the possibility is just endless to draw on the depth of the truth of the gospel that we have in ways that we can learn to explore in the way we are trying to in our own, hopefully humble way as well.
Yeah. Well, I think you're a beautiful example of that. You've remained, so rooted in this tradition, and you've cast such a wide net, to look for wisdom outside of it, and, spent so much of your own time and energy and resources to share that with others. And so I want to sincerely thank you for that.
No, thank you.
Is there anything else either of you would like to add before we close up here?
Just thank you so much for this opportunity to be with you both, Tim and Aubrey.
Yeah, thanks so much, you two. This has been really beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you both.
Yeah, thank you. All right, thanks so much for listening. We really hope that you enjoyed this conversation with John Kesler and Thomas McConkie. If you'd like to learn more about the events they'll be hosting this summer, you can check out all of those in the show notes. There will also be links there for Thomas's online course, Transformations of Faith, and his newest book from Faith Matters Publishing at 1 Mint. And if Faith Matters content is resonating with you and you get the chance, we would love for you to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you listen on. We read all of the reviews, and it really helps us to get the word out about Faith Matters, and we appreciate the support. Thanks again for listening, and remember, you can check out more at faithmatters.org.